Welcome to the Wisden Cricket Weekly podcast in association with Charles Tyrwhitt, who are supporting the podcast in the build-up to the Ashes and across Wisden's coverage of the series. Known, among other things, for their stylish shirts, it's worth checking out their knitwear range, including crew necks, V-necks, or even their zip necks. Available in a variety of colours and perfect for wearing both in the office or even when you're working at home. During this period, we'll be offering a discount for all our listeners. If you use the code Wisden20 at checkout, as the code suggests, you'll get 20% off your order. That's code Wisden20. I think on this show, we'll actually talk about a fair bit of real cricket that was played in the last week, which makes a pleasant change to recent weeks. I'm Yas Rana, and with me in the studio today is the managing editor of Wisden.com, Ben Gardner, the magazine editor of Wisden Cricket Monthly, Joe Harman, and the editor-in-chief of Wisden Cricket Monthly, Phil Walker. Let's start with the first test between the number 1 and 2 ranked sides on the planet, an absorbing, seesawing final day draw at Kanpur, where New Zealand just about clung on for the draw, finishing 9 down in their second innings. Joe, it's not a full-strength India side, but New Zealand will be pretty content with that result. India very rarely don't win at home.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose what you might qualify that with is this was their best chance to get a win. India have got a couple of players back. We saw with England's tour out there that they got the win early and then India hit their stride. So they might look back on this test as a missed opportunity, given the position they were in on day 2, day 3. But yeah, given the final day, the final session, New Zealand will be pretty pleased with that. Kind of backs to the wall effort. Again, as it seems to be with New Zealand, it's sometimes those lesser names that stand up when they most need them. Somerville had a crucial innings at the start of that day 5. And then Ravindra, seeing them home effectively, or seeing them to the draw. And it's interesting the way they went about it as well, that obviously you expect spin to dominate, but it was Jamieson and Southey who took the bulk of the wickets for the New Zealand side. And you can see, even in conditions which don't necessarily suit them particularly, they still play to their strengths and are still a very, very effective, durable side that are just very hard to beat.
Ben, talk to us about Rachin Ravindra. You watched him in the Under-19 World Cup 4 years ago. Now he's been on the New Zealand radar for a while. He's still only 22 and a very impressive debut, battling out at the end of that day 5.
Yeah, well, I guess the interesting thing is that he's sort of, well, firstly, the interesting thing that sort of grabs the headlines to begin with these sort of SEO who is pieces is that his name Rachin comes from his dad, who's a huge cricket fan, and it's literally a portmanteau of Rahul and Sachin after Dravid and Tendulkar, which is interesting. But I guess with him being selected in this side, that it looks like they've picked him as a spinner and as a bowling all-rounder, when actually he's kind of plied his trade as a batting all-rounder. In that Under-19 World Cup, he was batting in the top 3, top 4. He's got a pretty good first-class record and is kind of, I'm not sure he'll ever be a frontline spin option. And he didn't take a wicket in this game, but did bat very capably. So I think that that's where, if he is to become a long-term test player, that'll be where it is. It'll be in the top 5, fitting in with a few overs here and there. But yeah, I mean, that New Zealand side had quite a few really promising players at that World Cup. They had Finn Allen in it as well, who has obviously set the T20 world alight since then, got a replacement gig at RCB, and he was, a lot of them just looked like very assured and very confident, and that's how he kind of came across. And so it's no surprise that he's kind of taken to this straight away, because he didn't seem like a very overawed character then, and that's how it seemed then. I'd say that on New Zealand with the seamers, it was really interesting that it was those bowling well, because it was quite an interesting pitch in that it was like a lot. They got a bit of criticism, but a pitch that where it goes down to the last ball of day 5 is normally quite a good one. It didn't turn loads at the beginning and was turning a bit and back keeping a bit low, but not excessively. And there wasn't a huge amount in it for the bowlers, but I think because the quicks, because the quicks were so good, they were kind of able to get something out of it anyway. Like Umesh Yadav is just a brilliant bowler at home who can kind of summon something from nothing. And Tim Southey was absolutely phenomenal. Like, I think that coming in, looking at it from a New Zealand point of view, the most interesting was, like, can Kyle Jamieson do it away from the helpful conditions? And he did bowl really well. But the main thing was just a reminder of just like how good Southey is basically everywhere he bowls, like getting reverse swing. And that 5 was absolutely brilliant. And he's got an amazing record in Asia, averages like under 25 with the ball, which is, and people think of him, I think, as like a sort of a swing bowler basically. And he needs to have that, like a new ball and a bit like what people say about James Anderson. He's those clouds to do it, but this was just a phenomenal performance from a guy who can kind of do it everywhere, I think.
And in the last few years, his career almost stepped up to another level that he hadn't previously reached. Quickly, do you think that New Zealand missed a trick not playing Neil Wagner going for three spinners?
Yeah, well, with what Joe was saying about how, because I thought it was interesting how both teams sort of approached it throughout the game at different points. Like I think there were moments looking back where they might both think they could have gone for the kill a little bit more, and I think not having Wagner was particularly damaging towards the end of day one when India were 140 for 5, and then Shreyas Iyer and Jadeja battered out the day. That's when you really wanted sort of a spell of make something from nothing short balls from him. And there's a bit of, you're not going to pick a player to target just the debutant, and that wouldn't be what they were picking for anyway. But he was that's what people suggest, that he might have a slight issue with the short ball, and there wasn't obviously Jameson and Southey are both bowlers who like to get it up fuller, so he wasn't having to survive that sustained barrage. And then on day 4, there was a point after tea when the game kind of just stalled for a bit. India scored 30 runs in 15 overs. New Zealand weren't really trying to get those last 3 wickets or last 2 wickets, and you kind of thought that actually for both sides, if New Zealand had got those wickets right then and really gone for the kill, then they would have been chasing 200, 220 in just under 4 sessions, and they're really in with the chance. And if India obviously score 60 runs then and can declare 5-10 overs earlier, then they probably would have won the game. So it was
We've not talked about Shreyas Iyer yet. Sensational debut. Hadn't played a first-class game since 2019. And he's given the India selectors a massive headache with Kohli coming back to the side. Rahane averages 32 over his last 50 test matches. Pujara 27 in his last 16 tests. Surely it's time for one of them to go.
Well, Rahane would be the obvious man to give way. He bats at 5 and is hanging on by his fingertips, really. I watched most of that 100 on the first day. And the way he kind of took himself through that last hour was especially impressive, I thought. And it just shows, I think, how how if you play the IPL week after week, then you're just used to those big moments, those kind of clutch moments. And so final over of the day, and he's kind of moving up towards that landmark, and the ball is there. I think it was Somerville, the off-break bowler, and it was a new ball, and he landed it in the spot, and it was the last over of the day, and it was there to hit. So he just slaps it over mid-wicket for 6, and then strolled off as if this was just another game of cricket. And I think these young Indian players who come through that breeding ground of IPL cricket, they're just used to these kinds of moments. So he took to it very naturally. He's a good player to watch. He's very, very kind of wristy, very loose limbed in the way that he plays spin in particular, and that's not a cliche because many Indian players don't play like that. Shubman Gill he's very elegant, but he's more kind of mechanical, and but Iyer has a very natural flow to the way he plays, especially the slow bowlers, and he made a very important 60 odd in the second innings. Without that, New Zealand, as Joe alluded to earlier, they should have been in the scrap to win the game on the last day at the very least. They were 150.
Well, India were 51 for 5 at one point in their second innings before.
But in New Zealand's first innings, they were 100 odd for 0, 120 for 0 overnight, and then fell away and to actually give up a first innings lead in the end. And deep down, as Joe said, India had a few out. Obviously, they could have really pushed that one home, but considering it's only 5 minutes since the last big game of cricket and the core of India's team are resting with good reason, it turned into a very good test match, and it was good to see that the crowds came out for it and they were engaged as well on the final day. I thought that was a positive thing. And so as ever, despite inauspicious surroundings, the test game throws up another good one.
Yeah, it's an interesting time in Indian cricket in that you think one or both those players will have to make way soon, if not immediately. I think Rahane probably will miss out for the next test match, and it's probably overdue, really. I remember Kohli saying a while back that he wanted these exciting young batting talents to get an opportunity young and to play when they were playing at their best. And you could certainly argue that in the case of Rahane, and now increasingly with Pujara, that the old players are getting given too long, and some of the young players aren't getting their chances early enough. Like Iyer's 26 now, could arguably have played a couple of years ago. And and there are other young talents kind of bubbling under that, need to be seen, and they've got a wealth of options, and there's always going to be this dilemma, but it does feel like India and Kohli have clung on a bit too long to certainly Rahane and potentially Pujara as well.
Do you think it's almost harder to drop players nowadays in the COVID bubble era, that the time they spent with each other is so intense, and that you're not just deleting someone from a WhatsApp group, you're saying, no, you're not part of our hotel quarantine for the next forever long?
It certainly does add an extra element of cruelty to dropping someone. I can see that. And in the case of Rahane, he's obviously got a lot of credit in the bank. He was hugely influential in a pivotal moment in Indian cricketing history, leading India to victory in Australia when Kohli obviously went home for the birth of his child. So you can understand why there is that desire to let Rahane have another chance and to not kind of write him off so soon after that victory. But on his batting alone, he doesn't really deserve to be in the team at the moment, and that's probably been the case for a while now.
Moving on to the Ashes, there's been a fair bit of news since the last pod. Tim Paine has taken an indefinite mental health break from the game, which means that he is unavailable for at least the start of the Ashes. His manager, James Henderson, tweeted, "We are extremely concerned for his and Bonnie's well-being and will be making no further comment at this time." Pat Cummins has been confirmed as Australia's 47th men's test captain, and Alex Carey is being tipped to replace Paine in the squad, though that's not yet confirmed. Carey averages a shade under 35 in first-class cricket and has played 83 times for Australia in white ball cricket. Phil, I know there was some discussion on last week's pod about whether bowlers can captain, but thoughts on the Cummins appointment?
Under any normal circumstances, if the game hadn't gone completely, haywire, then the loss of Australia's Test captain 2 weeks before the first ball's bowled at the Gabba would be the biggest story in world cricket. But such is the unhinged mood around international cricket at the moment that it just felt like just that day's story almost. A word on Paine. I'm not going to get into the messiness of it. He was held up as the unifier figure, as this kind of white knight coming in on the back of Sandpaper Gate and all the rest of it. It was described, I think it was on the Grade Cricketer. He's Matt Wade with blue eyes and nice hair. He's still a kind of classic Aussie mongrel cricketer, and overall, I think history will be pretty kind to him. I think he did a pretty good job in tricky circumstances, not least maintaining his own acceptable form just about. As I say, I'm not going to get into the muckiness around his dismissal and CA's Cricket Australia's mishandling of the whole thing. But what it probably does mean, if you're looking at it purely from a players on the pitch position, then it probably makes Australia slightly stronger, I would say. Alex Carey's been brought into the squad overnight. He's a brilliant cricketer. We saw him in the World Cup 2019 and thought, well, he's going to play 50 plus test matches without a doubt. He's class. He'll slot in there at number 7. He's good left-hand bat, good keeper, all the rest of it. Can Pat Cummins captain effectively? Well, Greg Chappell, we got an interview with Greg Chappell this week for WCM, and he was interesting on this. And obviously Greg Chappell has forgotten more about Test captaincy than most will ever know. And he has his reservations regarding the idea of a bowling captain. He says you're often going to be caught between two stools, either bowling yourself too much, as say you saw with Flintoff at Lords in 2006 when he bowled 67 overs against Sri Lanka and then conked out straight after that. Or you don't bowl enough because you feel like not just there's too many balls juggling that you have to be on top of, but also you feel kind of instinctively compelled to give other players their head, because that's a captain is a facilitator as well as a leader. So Chappell has his reservations, but he also said, look, there wasn't anybody else. You couldn't have gone back to Smith. Warner isn't appropriate. also constitutionally not appropriate as well. I think that was one of the sort of sandpaper elements, that he was no longer going to be considered for a leadership role.
Still banned. Yeah,
still banned. Yeah, ludicrous. The whole thing's ludicrous. But anyway, we don't need to go down that road again.
It's interesting though that Steve Smith's back. That's kind of like probably the most interesting appointment.
Indeed, and I forget which Aussie big hitter it was who said that he's always found it slightly odd that Smith received the public's sympathy and Warner its opprobrium when Smith was the leader. Smith's the one in control. I think it might have been Greg's brother Ian. Actually.
It was Ian Chappell, wasn't it?
This is the Chappell show.
Yeah.
He's quite interesting on that whole thing because his speculation is that Warner got a harsher ban because of his role in the pay dispute, because Warner was sort of the leader of the players, and that was one saying like, if you don't kind of give us what we want, there might not be an Ashes series.
Yep. Labuschagne, not really considered realistically. Not only is he still a bit green as a Test player, although he's obviously an excellent one, but as Chappell put it, and I've read this elsewhere as well, he wears his heart almost too much on his sleeve. And if you think about great Australian captains, they're flinty, they're inscrutable. And Labuschagne is a more kind of emotionally driven kind of cricketer, which is fine and great, but not what you're looking for really in a leader. Cummins, of course, is the blue-eyed boy, and he will do, no doubt, a very tidy, dutiful job. He will please the sponsors, he will please the stakeholders and all the rest of it. But there's a reason why historically in Test cricket you don't get bowlers who are captains, because it's one hell of a workload.
I mean, I thought his kind of opening comments as he was named captain were quite interesting as well, because he almost presented it as a joint captaincy with Steve Smith. He said,
is that right?
Yeah, I mean, he said he was adamant that he wanted Steve Smith to be his vice. Not that, I don't know if it was his choice as such, but that's what he wanted, and it happened. And also accepted that there will be times when he'll need to listen to people more than himself, I think was the way he put it. And we talked about this a bit when Butch was on last week, and Butch was like, I wouldn't like that as a captain. Essentially kind of sharing the credit, I think was kind of what he was getting at. And I think there will be a bit of that now. I think when decisions are made and they go right or wrong, there'll be a bit, did Cummins make it or did Steve Smith make it? And that could either work in Cummins' favour, or it could actually kind of hamper him as he goes on as well. But all that's kind of speculation. I think basically, as Phil was alluding to, they didn't really have much choice. He was the obvious candidate, and he fits in lots of different ways at this point. But none of us know he's a good captain. That's the one thing. None of us have seen him. I think he's captained 2 one-day games in Australian domestic cricket. Maybe a couple more than that, but not much at all.
Yeah, I suppose if you're going to have a bowling captain, you need a strong vice, just because you might miss games here and there with rest and rotation and stuff. So you need a vice captain who has the respect of the dressing room. Whether Smith has that after Sandpaper Gate, I don't know, but that's why you'd need sort of that joint ticket, I suppose. But I guess the one thing's interesting, Phil, you described Cummins as the blue-eyed boy, and it does feel to an extent like this cycle is kind of repeating itself. I mean, maybe Cummins is, the perfect deity that he's been sort of painted to be. He's kind of guarded against it. He says, everyone has made mistakes in their past, and maybe it's a bit harsh to judge people on things that happened before they actually got to the job, which they're now losing because of the thing they did before. But he's saying that, but I don't think anyone is hugely listening. I mean, as the sponsors want, a poster boy to hang their hat on, and that is Cummins, and so no doubt when he if he messes up, that will be how could this have happened? We thought you were perfect, Pat, just as it was with Tim Paine. And
not even a digger as scurrilous as you, Ben Gardner, could find anything on Pat Cummins.
But because of course Cummins wasn't even aware of the ball tampering scandal as he was part
famously,
of it as well.
Yeah. On Carey, it's quite interesting. I agreed with what Taha said on last week's show. I think Payne's actually done okay with the bat. It's not as if Australia have got loads of wicket-keeping options to choose from. And Carey, I think it's quite an interesting one. He averages about 20 in this year's Sheffield Shield. His overall first-class record is decent. But his overall limited overs record for Australia, aside from that World Cup, is pretty poor, actually. He averages 11 in T20 cricket, given after 38 games. He averages 36 in ODI cricket, which is fine, but that World Cup plays a big part in those numbers. He's not actually done that well for Australia in limited overs cricket. So I don't think he improves that side. I think Payne's done, by and large, a fine job.
He's a different type of player as well, isn't he? And this is, I think he's averaging 22 this year, but from quite a small sample size. He's had 2 or 3 very good years in first-class cricket up to this point. but also the way he plays, he's not obviously no Gilchrist, no one is, but I can see him taking the game away from England or kind of ramming it down their throats in a way that was just never going to happen with Paine at 7. He's shown in the past that he can block out and he can hang around, but Carey could play the sort of innings which actually wins you a test match, a bit like Haddon did in 13-14, and I think that's what would worry me from an English perspective, that now they've got a different type of player to contend with.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
They'll also see him as a player who can rise to the occasion, like which in some ways they'll see as making those numbers as irrelevant almost, like the fact that it was at a World Cup that he had, his best in as a cricketer, and that even in that semi-final, he got hit in the head, gets his sort of jaw bandaged up, and then comes out and keeps playing and gets Australia up to like some sort of total. And then even in that ODI series last year when it got down to a decider and Australia lose a few early, and then he hits 100, like a really a sort of gritty but an excellent 100 in the end.
That's a good description, that 100.
Those kind of things will almost add stock, that they'll think that, okay, the record might not be there exactly as we'd want it to be, but we've seen this guy when it comes to those moments when the pressure's on, he kind of thrives off that, and I think that's what they'll hope will happen, I guess.
England have literally not played a ball since the last pod. They've had every single day of their inter-squad friendlies rained off. There's hope that the forecast is better for the remaining couple of days of the current game. Are England going to win the Ashes, guys? If you Google Brisbane Test rain, the first 3 results are quite funny. So the Courier Mail headline reads, Brisbane weather forecast ominous with green pitch predicted. 9 wide World of Sports. Their headline is Heavy Rain in Brisbane throws Ashes preparations into chaos. Cricket.com AU, Brisbane rain and Ashes leveller, says Cameron Green. This week, the Western Australia Premier, Mark McGowan, reiterated his state's strict quarantine rules, which puts the Perth test under severe doubt, and the mooted options are tests in either Hobart, which is a UK-type climate, or another pink ball test, but this time in Melbourne. So you could have a green one at Melbourne, a day-night at Adelaide, the Boxing Day test on the road at the MCG, Sydney test, fair enough, give that to Australia, then a second pink ball test, which supposedly suits England. Rob Barman asked, what percentage chance do you give England of winning the Ashes? Mine was around 20%, but has dropped due to rained off warm-up games. What do you reckon?
Sounds like at least 100, right? I mean,
5-0.
Yeah, it's funny how Phil was saying that, the Paine news kind of happened and then cricket moved on to the next story, whereas it's a bit of rain that has thrown the Ashes into chaos. And also, we should say that the rain is sort of, it plays a bit of havoc with England's warm-ups, but it's happening because of this weather condition.
There we go.
Which is, the other thing that England have got in their pocket. It's La Nina, which is a sort of cool weather system that makes it rain a bit more, basically. And it was around in 2010-11 when England did okay.
5-0.
Around last year when India obviously beat Australia.
And does it affect the whole of Australia?
I think so. Yeah. And it's not just that it makes it cloudy, but with the green pitch, it rains more, so it makes it harder to prepare those sort of like properly hard baked flat surfaces.
Well, this gives up maybe 0-0 is the way to.
The one fly in the ointment, and clearly there is something in this. And two day-night test matches will even the scales for sure.
You say that,
Ben makes a good point about England are really, really bad recently.
Well, this is what I was going to say. This is what I was going to say. In theory, you think, yeah, sure. Except Australia are unbeatable in day-night test matches. Their seamers are marvellous in all conditions, but especially when the ball does a little bit as well. Okay, England's players are used to playing the swinging ball more than Australia's are. And so if there is one Achilles heel in that Australian batting lineup, then arguably it could be against the swinging ball. But it's never really played out in reality. It's never played out. England went to Adelaide 4 years ago and thought, okay, we might be in this one. They weren't. They got blown away on day 5 quite comfortably in the end.
They got bowled out for 58 by New Zealand in a day-nighter.
That they did.
And then
Auckland.
lost a 2-day to India in a day-nighter.
Yeah, for sure. I'm well aware of this. So, look, you know that I've been cautiously, probably myopically, and probably wrongly optimistic for the last month or two, right? And
but only relatively.
Relatively, yeah. I mean, I went 3 to Australia in the magazine last month. I think England are well within their capabilities to win a couple of games. I can't really see it going any further than that, but I'd be shocked if England don't win one. and with a fair wind and a bit more rain around, then maybe they might win 2. And then after that, God only knows.
I think it's fair to say the more messiness, the more things that go wrong, the more things that it's not just what you expect, then England's chances start to creep up very slightly. But I did have them quite low to begin with, so I'm not getting ahead of myself at this point.
So only 4-1.
Well, if we can get out of Brisbane at 0-0, then that's a great start. That's a really, really good start to the series.
Excellent. Jamie Burkham asks, to lighten the mood, if you got one of the current England Test team in a secret Santa, what would you get them? You've got a limit of £15 and you can't buy them runs or wickets.
Oh, what? You should have warned us on this one.
Well, the way things are going, you can get a Wisden umbrella at wisden.com/shop, although not 15.
Probably not
£15. I haven't checked the prices. You might have to share one.
You could get a third of a bottle of rye whiskey, which is really excellent. But yeah, only a third of it, unfortunately.
Yeah, plenty at wisden.com/shop.
Maybe Joe Root some sort of relaxation method, like one of those head scratcher things. That'd be nice.
How to win friends and influence people for Jonny Bairstow. Get that for him. An Ian Jury album for Dan Lawrence. I reckon he'd enjoy that. New Boots and Panties. New Boots and Panties for Dan Lawrence. He probably hasn't heard it. He'd really enjoy that.
Ben, anything to add?
Not usually. Sorry. Brilliant. It's not where he comes alive, stuff like that.
I spoke to Butch the morning after we recorded the rest of the pod to talk about England's Ashes preparations. Butch, it's fast becoming the norm now that teams go into marquee test series with minimal match preparation under their belt. Neither New Zealand nor India played anything before their series at the moment. I don't think India played anything before their series at home to England early in the year. England had 2 intra-squad friendlies penciled in, but rain meant that they won't get more than a couple of days of cricket in before the first test. I had a look at what you were used to when you played, and I think you played 4 games before the 02-03 series. When you played on overseas trips, how much importance did you put into these pre-season warm-up games? How useful were they?
I mean, they were useful, but perhaps not in the way that people would imagine. I mean, everybody gets their own individual things out of those matches. For some guys, for the bowlers, perhaps it was about getting sort of enough overs under your belt that you were ready to go, but not so many that you were sort of carrying any fatigue into the first test. For some batters, it was really important to spend a lot of time out in the middle. For others, it was a kind of, I would rather do my preparation in an environment where I wasn't worried about getting out. So you were trying to find some sort of fluency and timing in your movements. And so I played a lot of warm-up matches in test matches all over the world and very rarely scored any runs in any of them. It didn't bother me too much that was the case. But other players feel very differently about it. I guess one of the interesting things is that the matches that England have been slated to play have been sort of against one another. I think that's an interesting thing because it's very difficult. One of the great things about playing warm-up matches, particularly in Australia, is that the way that the state sides or the players who were not test players would come out and really try and have a proper go at you. And in many respects, that was the most sort of important or the most preparing thing for sort of a test match at the Gabba, which was that you'd have Aussies snarling at you. There'd be genuine sort of animosity, genuine genuine unpleasantness before you got into the first test. And that is gold dust. Sort of getting used to the idea of it being a real contest. And you aren't going to get that. I mean, I don't care what you say, you're not going to get that in a match between a lot of people that you know.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at that 02-03 tour, across the Test series and the ODI series, England played 9 warm-up games and didn't win a single one. You talk about competitive games. Yeah. Martin Love scored a double 100 playing for Australia in Test matches.
I think Martin
warm-up cricket.
Well, Martin Love, I think he might have scored 1,000 runs against England in the tour matches. We didn't get him out, I don't think. But then in the test match, he didn't score any runs at Sydney in the test matches. So it kind of, it doesn't follow that doing one thing in the warm-ups means you do another in the test matches themselves. I mean, I'd probably go back to, as far as my Ashes experience is concerned, I'd go back to my first trip, which was 98, 99, in which I'd had more stitches in my face than I'd scored runs leading into the first test at Brisbane, and then made 100 in the test match. So it kind of, it kind of doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It matters, but it doesn't matter, and it gives all of the speculators and the media and the pundits something to talk about in the lead up. But at the end of it all, it matters little. I suppose the one thing that you could say that I think was unbelievably important in England's last success in 10-11 was not what the individuals did, but the way that the team sort of prepared themselves for Ashes battle, which was they would put themselves under pressure and try to win those warm-up matches. I think very often you go into these tours, and it was certainly the case in 2002-03 and certainly the case in 98-99, where you went into the matches where individuals were trying to get whatever they wanted out of the games. Whereas Strauss and co we're going there to win these matches. These are like, there's points on these, it's like playing proper first class matches where you're trying to win the league. And I think that in essence is a brilliant way to go about the preparation. And everything else is doesn't really matter, to be honest with you.
I guess that got lost slightly in recent years when the quality of the touring sides declined quite a lot. I think Australia, when they came here in 2019, before COVID and all that, they played themselves as well because they just didn't really trust the quality of opposition. Counties would put out a second team basically, and that's not really great.
Yeah,
for a test match.
And that had been the case actually. I go back to my first time I ever saw Shane Warne, and first time I ever saw potentially I think Glenn McGrath, although my memory might not be quite right on that. But on the 93 Ashes trip, first time Warney came over, Surrey they'd play against Surrey at the Oval early season, when they first arrived basically. And it was very much, that's why I was playing. It was very much sort of like a second 11 thing. So England had always done that, or most of the counties had always done that because the fixture schedule was just so mad, back in those days. Nothing's changed really. The first 11s would take the opportunity to have a bit of a rest and the second string would play against the touring team. Now, Australia always looked at it differently. They would throw out the best players that they possibly could in the state matches in order to try and beat us up, which is basically what happened. That's what they used to do. But that's the Australian psyche, as far as that is concerned, has changed a little bit as well. Of course, there wasn't the big bash back in those days. So, a lot of sort of first class players, a lot of the first string players might not be engaged in first team cricket or first class cricket while the preparations for the Ashes trip is going on. So the landscape has changed massively on both sides as far as the prep for these series is concerned.
I know you said that the media puts too much emphasis on what happens in warm-up games, so I'm going to ask you two questions about what happened overnight. On the day of cricket we just had, are you slightly surprised that they didn't mix the teams up more? We've had such little cricket. Was there really much use in Alex Lee's batting for an entire session? Only two top 7 batters who might plausibly play the first test batting. There were Corley and Pope, who scored 45 and 27 respectively.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, isn't it? But I suppose you could look at it the other way around and say that the England's sort of first string bowlers, got a bit of mileage in their legs against a batter who made them wait for it, made them work for it a little bit. So I suppose, but yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? If you end up getting the next couple of days washed out, then your first choice top 3 don't get much of a hit. It's just, the whole thing is very, very, very suboptimal, and you're just going to have to make the best of it. But I suppose it's the same for the Australians as well.
I don't want to infer too much from the lineups, but England picked Jonny Bairstow in that England 11, whose top 7 is the incumbent lot from the India series ahead of Ollie Pope. It was reported that Bairstow would have stayed in the side ahead of Pope for the cancelled Old Trafford test when Butler was returning after the birth of the child. I know Bairstow did well in Australia last time round, but since the start of 2019, he has the 3rd worst average of any top 7 batter in the world who's batted 20 or more times. He averages 21 in his last 18 tests. I appreciate this is a leading question, but what do you make? It is a leading question. Possibly picking Bairstow ahead of Pope.
Well, so Ollie Pope in South, the best I think that Ollie Pope's played for England was on England's victorious trip to South Africa. What was that? The sort of like the end of 2019, beginning of 2020. And he looked every inch, a test match, number 5, number 6 on that trip. Kookaburra ball, bouncy pitches, etc. And so, the undoubted promise that Ollie Pope has, and people, I suppose the expectations on him, because his county average is so fantastic. When he doesn't make 100 every time he plays for England, everyone says he's massively overrated. Well, no, I don't think so. And I think that conditions in Australia, being as they are, very similar to those in South Africa, the Wanderers, where he made that sparkling 100 against Nokia and co, would suit him just as much as they did down there. So that would be a shame. I suppose that that Jonny Bairstow's numbers are pretty shocking, but England would point to consistency and say that he would have played in that Test match at Old Trafford. Pope only got the chance to make the 80 that he did at the Oval because of the birth of Josh Butler's child, and so they're just reverting to the plan that they had before then. I think it's a long-winded way of me saying I think it's a mistake. I think Ollie Pope should probably start in front of Jonny Bairstow, but Jonny, it's maybe the last chance saloon for Jonny, and when he's in that situation, quite often he comes up with something. So from an England point of view, you hope that that's the case, but I think it's a wrong move.
I feel like that's at least the 10th time in the last year or so someone said it's last chance saloon for Bairstow. I mean, Pope scored 81 in his last Test match. Bairstow hasn't scored that many runs in innings for something like 3 years.
No, indeed, and Jonny Bairstow in that last Test match got spiked by Bumrah, didn't he? Quite famously in that second inning. So, mate, look, I don't know. I don't pick the team, but I've laid out all the reasons as to why I wouldn't do what they're going to do.
Good way to end. Here's Butch. Cricket 22 is out on
That's what I get them. Cricket 22. Yeah.
Cricket 22 is out on the 2nd of December on PlayStation 4 and 5, Xbox One and Series X or S, and PC. It's the latest game from Big Ant, the biggest name in cricket simulations. Cricket 22 gives you unprecedented depth with new controls, gameplay, a narrative-driven career mode, a new commentary team, and all new team and competition licenses. Play along with this year's Ashes competition, take part in the 100, or move through the ranks to represent your nation at the highest level. Cricket 22 has it all, and remember, it's out now. Aside from the India-New Zealand series, there have been a couple of other tests going on that have been fun. Pakistan beat Bangladesh, chasing down 202 and winning by 8 wickets. Bangladesh actually had a first innings lead of 44. They recovered from 49 for 4 to post 330. There's a first test ton for Litton Das. Hassan Ali continued his extraordinary resurgence in Test cricket with figures of 551 in the first innings. Pakistan were bowled out for 286. There was a 4th test on for Abid Ali, a half century on debut. I'm going to get to Abid Ali. Got some good stats on Abid Ali. A half century on debut from Abdullah Shafiq in just his 4th first-class game, but not much else from the rest of the order. Taijul Islam took a 7 for Bangladesh. Shaheen then took a second innings fifer to leave Pakistan needing 202, which they chased down with ease. The openers did the business again. Abid with 91, Shafiq with 73. So on Abid Ali is an interesting one because he averages pretty much 50 in Test cricket, but he's either incredible or really bad depending on his opposition.
I was going to say, the opposition seemed quite key to that.
Yeah, so here we go. Averages 75 against Bangladesh, 161 against Sri Lanka, 275 against Zimbabwe, but against England it's 27, New Zealand 19, West Indies 18, and South Africa 8. So quite a big difference there, depending on opposition. And then Abdullah Shafiq's very interesting because, as I said, only his 4th first-class game. He's been part of Pakistan's travelling squads for a year or so now. He's very highly rated, and apparently by King Babar himself. There's a good piece on ESPN Cricket Info by Umar Fareeq about Shafiq. Basically, he hasn't played that much first-class cricket, partly because of COVID, but also because in 2019-20, his first-class side was really good. So I had Babar Azam, Azhar Ali, Abid Ali, Salman Butt, and Ahmed Jazad have all played for Pakistan. So he was basically stuck in the twos in this really good team ahead of him. He then got picked to play for Pakistan A, or they call Pakistan Shaheens, and he scored 100 for them, and he scored 100 for number 3 on his state debut, and he's done really well in T20 cricket as well. So he's one to watch.
These were technically his first 2 first-class half-centuries. He had two
Don't get Andy Zaltzman started on this. Because he'd had 2 centuries, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. It passed 50.
But, yes, but that's how everyone defines it. So
sure.
Zaltzman can seek me out if you want.
Sri Lanka 1-0 up at home against...
What a fight that would be.
That is Hugh Grant calling Firth vibes.
Pay-per-view.
Can I just say something about Shaheen as well?
Go for it.
There was a amusing moment when right at the start of Bangladesh's second innings, when he was fielding a ball on the boundary and it was sort of a bit ungainly, and then you heard a couple of Bangladesh fans just shouting like Matthew Wade at him after the T20 World Cup semi-final. And you think if there's any bowler who sort of has as good hot streak, there's no bowler who has better hot streaks than Shaheen right now. So if there's anyone you don't want to fire up, it's him. And then it's tough. He couldn't really watch this game anywhere, so I was having to sort of find dodgy streams and hazy clips and this sort of thing. But the new ball spell just looked ridiculous, basically, like beating the bat by absolutely miles. Who's the Bangladesh number 4 that he got out twice with, and they showed a pitch map of the 2 short balls, and both just like right up at the throat that you just like there is no way to play those. And yeah, he was just, obviously he's amazing. He's now in the top 5 in the world in the Test rankings, where he will presumably stay for quite a long time.
Hands down, my favourite.
Sri Lanka 1-0 up at home against West Indies. Lasith Embuldinia took a 4th innings 5 for there. At one point, West Indies were 18 for 6, chasing 348. The second test is 3 days in. It's pretty even at the moment. Sri Lanka are 2 down in their second innings, trailing by 3. Virasamy Pamal, the slow left-arm spinner, took a 5 for West Indies in his first test outing in 6 years. Joe, what's your moment of the week?
My moment of the week was press release came through yesterday that Sir Alastair Cook has signed a contract extension, 2 more years. He's added to his contract, which will take him up to 38 at Essex. Which, I mean, Essex will be hugely relieved. They've obviously Tenduskarta's retired. There's been a bit of upheaval there, obviously off the field as well. Things haven't been good. They wouldn't want to lose Cook at this point. I'm sure they'd be very grateful he's stuck around. Which I thought was interesting, particularly that it's a 2-year contract. He's taken out any of that kind of speculation next year. Will this be his last? Will this be his last? It won't. He's got at least 2 more. And who knows, he might kind of do a Trescothic and just go on and on. But it does strike me that you compare him to other England captains of the last 30 years. None of them, I mean, the last to carry on after, obviously some of them quit being England captain and played on as non-captain, but pretty much like Atherton, Stewart, Vaughan, Strauss, obviously, Hussain, as soon as they stopped playing for England, they stopped playing cricket altogether. So I guess Gooch would be the last one to go back to a couple of years after playing for England. And I just think even now it's even harder now with the intensity of Test cricket and the international schedule to stop and then just think, I'm going to play some county cricket for a while. I don't think many people at all would be up for it. So Cook does stand out as unique even after his Test career, which is phenomenal. And it's not even like he had a great year for Essex. That might have been another reason where he thought, I don't know if I can be bothered with this really. But he wants to stick around and come April will be walking out to open the batting against Darren Stevens or Chris Rushworth or whoever it might be, knowing it's a tough gig, but he still wants to do it. And there's something quite beautiful in its way about that, really, that he can still be asked to get out of bed and do it.
Yeah, I think you summed that up really well. I think there is a sense of unfinished business with him. I spoke to him in September. It was pissing down at the Oval and we had a chat and you could sense that he was frustrated. You could sense that there was a bit of a grievance as well about the way that the season had been set up as well.
Oh, he's angry about that, isn't he?
Yeah.
He hates the conference thing.
Indeed. And, he'd have batted literally 20 times before the end of May, and then hardly any cricket at all during the one-day stuff, and then you come back in to watch the rain fall a little bit in September, and so there was a definite sense of frustration there. Also, he does love playing for the club, and they obviously underachieved last year, so you can understand why. And also, if you take out the fact that it goes round corners and so on, it's quite a nice gig because he's obviously got a fair few quid in the bank anyway. He gets to do his media stuff with BBC through the winter and through the heart of the summer. He did a number of Test matches for the BBC, and then he has a bat for a couple of months. He has a go for a couple of months, knowing full well that you can't fail. It's only degrees of success, his career from here on in, because as he said famously to everybody, including me, no one can argue with 10,000 Test runs. No one can argue with that. So look, he's every time he sets foot in a cricket ground, it's from a position of unimpeachable success, which must be a nice place to be. So the Wolf of Writtle Street, he's back in 2 more years. Good to see.
On the county schedule, it's been reported that from next season there'll be some more games in the middle of the summer, county championship games, so crucially in the month of July. So last summer we complained quite a lot about how there's no cricket at all going alongside the English Test series. So if you're We talked about Dan Lawrence having very few opportunities to bat if you're slightly out of nick, etc. So that looks to be changing for next season. Jamie asked, on a scale of 1 to 11, how much did Phil enjoy the Alastair Cook new contract release video on the Essex social media feed?
12. Marvellous. Ben Gardner wasn't too happy about it. He thought it was a bum note by Essex, considering they've had a rough few weeks.
No, I didn't think that at all. I
First thing you said to me when I turned up at the office an hour ago.
No.
How dare
That's a misquoting. Yeah.
Moving on. Phil, your moment of the week.
My moment of the week was last Thursday. I went to Lords to the Chance to Shine Awards, annual awards. Obviously, it wouldn't have happened last year. It would have been Zoomed last year, but it was the first time back in the Thomas Lords suite this time round. And after a shit show of a few weeks for the game, it was absolutely needed for me and for others there as well. There was a definite kind of unity in the room. I think there was a groundswell of optimism, a shaky optimism for sure, and an acknowledgement by most of the speakers there, including the chief exec of Chance to Shine, Laura Cordingley, that the games had to suffer in order to learn a little bit more about itself and its place in the world. But within that recognition of the game's own reckoning, there were some rousing stories of characters, people who you don't know, who I didn't know before the night, whose names don't ring out through the game, who aren't paid money, who give up their time to making the game, and the young people who get to experience the game through the selflessness of these individuals. They're just getting the job done, and there's been a lot of mud slung at the game, and rightly so, in the last few weeks. Well, this was a moment to remind yourself that out there in the margins of the game, there are people doing good things, really great things, and what the game has gone through hurts people, really genuinely hurts them, because they care for the thing, and they spend a lot of their lives nurturing the game for the next generation and the generation after that. And so it was nice to be there. I sat on a smashing table. I had Keaton Jennings to my left and Jonathan Liu's name tag to my right. He didn't turn up.
I named and shamed there, Phil.
Well, I'm sure he had. I'm sure he was.
Doesn't he
doing
live in
something.
Berlin?
Sorry?
He lives in Berlin now, doesn't he?
Yeah. Maybe the email was down, or I don't know. Look, all right, scrap it. God, I shouldn't talk down to the king. I do appreciate that. It was just a little joke. Anyway, I had a lovely table full of, as I say, people whose names you wouldn't know, and I briefly spoke to a bloke called Shahid Ali, and he is a coach based in Sheffield, and he was actually Chance to Shine's coach for 2020, but he was there because this was the first live show again, if you like. And I spoke briefly to him, and I'd been told by somebody, this is a fascinating bloke. So I went and said hello, and we set up a time to have a chat the following day, and I called him up, not really knowing what to expect. He didn't feature that night because, as I say, he'd won the previous year. And I phoned him on a whim, really, on a Friday afternoon, and we had a chat for over an hour, and he's one of the most extraordinary people I've ever spoken to in this game. And I'm going to write it up in one of the upcoming magazines. But the work that he has done in a very rough part of working class South Sheffield, in the face of pressure from local gangs in particular, because what he is bringing cricket to local kids at the ages of 11, 13 and 15. Many of these kids would be corner boys and girls, but corner boys particularly, runners for the local drug gangs. He has offered them something else. These kids have naturally gravitated to something more positive, and in response, his tyres have been slashed on his car, his windows have been smashed in his house, and he lives in a cul-de-sac, right? So this is not just a random hit. He has been targeted because of the good he is doing in this community. There is, of course, many other layers to this bloke's story. Okay, he's trying to develop and nurture the game among the British Asian communities, and this is in Yorkshire. We don't have to elaborate too much on the challenges that he has faced, and which he was very open and upfront about discussing. And I put the phone down, and I was really quite moved by the whole thing. I've played through the transcript, and yeah, again, if you want just a glimpse into what's happening away from the headlines and away from who's batting 5 next week and who's got who's broken a finger or whatever, fine, that's all important. But it's the pageant. The real stuff happens behind that. And as I say, it's important for the game that we recognise these people and we don't just kind of, pat them on the back and say well done, but we actually celebrate the work that they do, because without them, the game is nothing.
I think what you said about it being a particularly moving month or so for the game, I think's definitely correct. And hearing those stories is really important. A few people messaged us and emailed in after the Rafiq podcast a couple of weeks ago, saying they were reduced to tears watching the testimony. I think I've spoken to a few people in the last couple of weeks who have been quite despondent about the game and being like, this is what I've spent my whole life being invested in, and I almost feel ashamed being associated with it. So those stories
and
are
it's
really
important that what I just said doesn't come across as just sort of whitewashing anything or being soppy. It's needed to sometimes just counterbalance the sort of tsunami of misery that it felt like we've had to weather over the last few weeks.
Related to that, the ACB have announced their plan to combat racism within the game. It's a 12-point plan. I'll run through some of the biggest talking points, I guess. Part of the plan is to get people within the game to understand and educate more, training for all those who work in cricket, including all staff, volunteers, recreational club officials, umpires, directors and coaches, removing barriers in talent pathways through measures to address talent identification and scouting, education and diversity of coaches, and targeted support programs for players from diverse or underprivileged backgrounds, publishing localised equity, diversity and inclusion action plans within 6 months with targets for board diversity, 30% female, locally representative ethnicity by April 2022, addressing dressing room culture, a full review of dressing room culture in all men's and women's professional teams, both domestic and international, creating welcoming environments for all, including accessible seating, food and beverage offering, catering to all faiths and cultures, and the availability of facilities such as multi-faith rooms and alcohol-free zones. That all sounds very good, and there's laudable targets in there, but I still feel a lot of that's quite abstract. Removing barriers in talent pathways, for one, is easier said than done. Don't know, anyone has anything to say?
I mean, there's loads of great stuff in there, but there is so much of it. It's quite hard to work out. I mean, I don't think you can do all those things at the same time. What's going to be prioritised? A lot of the things, as you kind of say, sound good on paper, but what do they actually amount to? So, for instance, the review of the dressing room cultures of all professional team men and women in the country jumped out at me. I mean, it sounds great. It sounds necessary. That is one hell of a piece of work. Who's doing it? Is it the ECB themselves, or are these professional teams reviewing their own cultures? That wasn't clear to me from the press release. I don't know if there's been more detail on that. Are the findings going to be made public? If so, what potential ramifications are there for those reviews? So it's kind of one of those things that you read it, you're like, well, that sounds sensible. But then actually there's so much that we don't know. It's quite hard to know what the reality of it will be, and whether they've just slapped so much stuff down on a piece of paper to kind of diffuse the situation. And the only answer you can say is we don't know. We'll have to see how it plays out. Certainly, I can't remember the name of the MP. It was a shadow cabinet minister who sat on the DCMS select committee, who was, I think, not optimistic about this, and said, well, how can we expect... She basically said, why are a lot of these things not already in place in cricket? They're actually just revealing some of the issues that were already there by announcing these things. And also, the people who haven't put those in place, can they be trusted to undertake this review and actually give honest findings? Which was obviously a huge part of the Yorkshire story, is that we couldn't trust them to do their own reporting. As Butch said on the programme a few weeks ago, they essentially marked their own homework, and we can't be in that situation where you're constantly diminishing the problems because you don't want to put yourself in the headlights, basically.
Yeah, it was Jo Stevens, the MP, and she called for an independent inquiry. So she said the report bears a reminder of previous ECB failures to get a grip on the racism scandal in golf and cricket. Many of the measures listed should have been in place years ago, and called for an inquiry.
Yeah, I tweeted a couple of weeks ago that I think every club in the country should be encouraged to have a specific inclusion officer on their committee. So someone whose sole job is to be responsible for new members, making sure the club is welcoming for everyone. I think that's just like quite an easy and I know that's a big job for an individual, but I think there's an easy step for the ECB to take to at least encourage it. Moving on, Ben, what's your moment of the week?
Well, my moment of the week, I suppose, is less positive than Joe and Phil's. It was the sort of the mess around the Women's Cricket World Cup qualifier. We mentioned it on the pod last week that there was a bit of COVID going around, and it's eventually been enough to cause the whole thing to be just cancelled completely. As I think 6 positive tests within the East Lankan team, and obviously with the new variant that's sort of a danger, and that people are taking quite seriously. That was enough to say, let's not play it on right now. Obviously, fair enough. If you think you can't play a tournament safely, you do have to put a halt on it. I think the two frustrations are, it feels like, to be honest, that cancelling the tournament altogether and not looking at sort of contingencies and other times and places to play it was kind of a first resort for the ICC rather than the last resort. This was like, as soon as sort of a difficulty presents itself. I mean, there's no money in them hosting like a proper, fair Women's Cricket World Cup qualifier, so if they can find an excuse to do away with a thing, then they will. I mean, it doesn't seem like it would be on the wit of man to have those teams that sit in contention to also be flown out to New Zealand ahead of the Women's World Cup and play a few extra games there, and then you have a marriage crash thing. It would even level the playing field between those teams and some of the others, because they'd have had a bit more game time leading into it. And then how they've then just chosen to decide who gets into the World Cup and also into the Women's Championships. This isn't just for one tournament. This shapes women's cricket, or women's international cricket, effectively for the next 4 years, based on the decisions they've made on this. And it's based on the ODI rankings. And obviously, the rankings get enough criticism as it is in general, even, towards the top of them. As you get further down, it gets even more sort of like flimsy. And especially in the women's game, when, Thailand, who are one of the better teams at the qualifiers, they push Pakistan pretty close, beat Bangladesh, beat Zimbabwe, but they don't have ODI status, so they're literally not able to get an ODI ranking and are therefore not able to qualify for the World Cup or to actually gain ODI status, because you gain ODI status based on your performance at these tournaments. And in fact, just 2 or 3 years ago, there was quite a lot of fanfare over the ICC saying that all tournaments will either have ODI status or not. So that was in place for the Men's Asia Cup and for the Men's World Cup Qualifier, and should have been in place for this tournament. And that was quietly sort of done away with on the day the tournament started. So Thailand thought they were going to be playing, a whole set of ODIs when they could get an ODI ranking. That was then taken away from them at the last possible moment. And then they
What
had
was the explanation for that?
there hasn't really been one, and that's the thing, that there's been very little messaging around this thing in general. They kind of said that this was in the playing conditions for the tournament, that if it was cancelled it would be decided on rankings. We've looked through the playing conditions pretty thoroughly. There's no mention of the rankings in the whole thing. It's just kind of fudged because because it's what they think is the easy option, and then basically because I guess they think they can get away with it. I mean, and it's not.
So can you explain the Women's Championship, the importance of that? So
yes.
Thailand aren't. So I think they were top of their group when the tournament was cut short, so they're not qualifying for the World Cup because that's based on ranking. But why is it important they're not in the championship?
That guarantees basically lots of bilateral cricket, which feeds into this overall structure. The Women's Championship was in a way the precursor to the Men's Cricket World Cup Super League. It's expanded from 8 teams to 10 teams from now on, which again is still just an absolutely glacial pace of progress. I mean, you can see from this tournament that Thailand beat Bangladesh, Bangladesh beat Pakistan, Pakistan beat West Indies in the T20 World Cup. They regularly push South Africa pretty close. There is quite obviously you'll get the occasional thrashing of a top team against a poor team, but actually there is quite a lot of equality or at least the teams like Thailand can compete against the best teams, and they're not going to get to do that more unless they get these opportunities. So it's been expanded to 10 teams. The extra 2 teams from last time will be Ireland and Bangladesh. Bangladesh have qualified for the World Cup, by the way, over Sri Lanka as well, which is quite a big shock. I mean, Jamari Atapatu is one of the most watchable players in the world, and she won't be at the World Cup, which is a shame, although I guess it's good for Bangladesh. But yeah, it just guarantees you to have, I think it's 7 bilateral series, or possibly it's 9 if they're playing all teams. I don't think they've announced the full fixture and structure for it yet. But yeah, it's lots and lots of games against the best teams in the world, where you get a bit of funding to go and travel to those places and have the team together more, and to test yourself against the best, to exchange ideas with those. It's a huge thing. I mean, this is how teams get better, is by playing the other best sides in the world, and that has been taken away from Thailand, who I guess they're one of the most heartwarming stories in world cricket, and they've had this huge setback put to them through absolutely no fault of their own.
How fair is the accusation that Thailand are being punished because they don't have a men's team?
Well, it is fair. I mean, if you look at, and arguably the giving a team full member status is dependent far too much on how the men's team does. You look at the fact that Afghanistan have full member status despite their women's team having never played an international fixture, when it's supposed to be that you have a full structure in place for women's cricket and for men's cricket, and the ICC just kind of ignored that when they let Afghanistan get full member status. Arguably, Thailand in women's cricket are better now than Afghanistan were when they got men's full member status, but there's seems very little danger of Thailand getting that. And if they had full member status, I think they would also have ODI status, which would have they would have been able to, they played an ODI, they played a 50 over series against Zimbabwe just before the tournament, for example, and that could have had ODI status when they might have been able to get some sort of ranking. But it's hard to, I mean, they'll keep battling because that's what they do, and they're a very good team. And I think the thing that's shame as well, they clearly just target these qualifying tournaments so much. I mean, you were there at the T20 World Cup Qualifier when they were sort of a breath of fresh air, and I think there was a photo that did the rounds then of them all having their phone background set to the official logo of the T20 World Cup 2020 in Australia, and obviously they qualified, and they had a picture of all the phones next to each other, showing how they're a united front with this one goal in mind. And then Natakan Chantam put up a picture of the women of the same thing with all the teams' phones having the 2022 Women's World Cup logo on it, and then just with a couple of heartbreak emojis, which is it is properly heartbreaking, I think.
Pretty pretty depressing story, isn't it?
Yeah, what I should say as well is just that Ed Joyce is the Ireland women's head coach, and he there's quite a lot of celebration from the Ireland players, which some people found a bit sort of not unsavoury, but the fact that they kind of got through on a technicality. But he did a thread saying that, look, it is obviously a huge thing for Irish women's cricket, but this is it is very sad for Thailand, and he suggested that the ICC just expand the Women's Championship to 11 or 12 teams next time, so that Zimbabwe, who also have made good strides, and Thailand can be included. And I mean, that seems like a no-brainer. Those are the best 12 teams, and there is a reasonable gap to the USA as we saw at this tournament. So.
Some other news. The ODI World Cup Super League series between South Africa and the Netherlands has been postponed amid concerns over the Omicron variant. But India, who are due to tour South Africa very soon, have reiterated their commitment to touring.
I saw that Dwayne Oliver is now available as well for South Africa. Yeah. So after they've had a rough 2 or 3 years, to have him potentially lining up alongside Nortje and Rabada.
Yeah, although he didn't have a good year at all for Yorkshire.
He's got a pretty mediocre county record in general, but in that time he's had a brilliant record in South Africa cricket, and he's been brilliant this season. So maybe it's just the wickets,
conditions, maybe. Yeah,
and possibly. I remember Taha making the point though that he just doesn't look anywhere near as quick. Maybe that's the county grind taking its toll. But he absolutely wasn't bowling 90 miles per hour when I saw him play this summer. But
Wayne Parnell is back as well for South Africa. He played in that first ODI against the Netherlands, sort of ever present. He is way younger than I thought he was. He's only 32.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, I thought at least 35. Anyway, the WBBL final took place this week. Marizan Kapp was the player of the match for scoring 31 off 23 and taking 1 for 25 as Perth Scorchers won their first title. Kapp's had a really good year. She not only won the 100 with Oval Invincibles, but she was also player of the match in the final 2. So that's 2 player of the match performances in finals for her in 2021.
I read she was really ill beforehand as well. She'd been kind of in bed for 3 days in the lead up to the game. And then obviously it was her up against her wife, Dani van Niekerk, in the final as well. And Kapp bowled her a maiden. I think it was the third over of the game. And said at the end that basically, I think it reminded me of when we spoke to Matt Parkinson about playing against Callum. I don't think there's much enjoyment to be had in that rivalry, and there was certainly no gloating. But pretty impressive performance given that she was really quite sick in the lead up to
it. There's been some news around the IPL mega auction. The 8 current IPL sides have announced who they're retaining ahead of the mega auction. Teams have retained between 2 and 4 players. Basically, if you don't retain 4 players, you might have more money. Well, you do have more money to spend in the auction itself. I'll just run through who has been retained So CSK have retained Jadeja, Dhoni, Gaikwad and Moeen. KKR, Narain, Russell, Varun Chakravarti and Venkatesh Iyer. Sunrisers have retained Kane Williamson, Abdul Samad and Umran Malik. So no Rashid Khan, no David Warner, no Jonny Bairstow. Mumbai have retained Rohit, Sharma, Jasprit Bumrah, Kieran Pollard and Surya Kumar Yadav. So no Hardik there. RCB have retained Kohli, Maxwell and Siraj. Delhi Capitals, Pant, Prithvi Shaw, Akshat Patel and Anrik Norkia. Rajasthan Royals, Sanju Samson, Josh Butler and Yashasvi Jaiswal, and Punjab Kings, Mayank Agarwal and Arshdeep Singh.
So no Stokes, no Archer.
Yeah.
I don't think they'd committed to being available, I think was what I read, which is part of it.
They've got to give up this Red Bull nonsense.
Well, yeah, it's interesting the dynamics at play though, because players can sort of negotiate with teams to get in that highest price bracket. But obviously, even in the highest price bracket, you might get more if you go to the auction. Like Rashid Khan is probably the most valuable player in there, and you'd imagine he might well get a huge payday. Interesting that Umran Malik got retained though. Obviously the 150.
Quick.
Yeah,
wasn't even in the team for the first 2/3, 3/4 of the tournament.
I guess that's anticipated that he could go for loads, just because fast bowlers have done in the past out of nowhere. To finish, so we got a question from Paul Hudson: who wins a Test match between a team of 11 batters and 11 bowlers? No all-rounders allowed.
That's a great question.
But I mean, it is a great question. But we need.
Oh, don't get all serious.
Well,
all right, let's
come on.
No, shut up. So let's extend it. So it's like 2 opening batsmen and a number 10 and 11, right? So there's no question that they can do a bit of this or a bit of that. So take Rory Burns, 11 Rory Burnses or 11 Hasib Hamids.
Yeah.
And 11, who bats 11 for England?
Jimmy Anderson.
Jimmy Anderson and Jack Leach, right? Anderson and Leach win that hands down.
Yeah.
Hands down.
Yeah.
10-0 in a 5-match series. They win that hands down. Discuss Ben Gardner.
Well, yeah, my point was just that it does obviously depend.
It cheapens the show. You'd rather the question wasn't even asked.
No. It just depends on who the bowlers and the batters are, because of their relative strengths. Like, if Joe Root is that batter, who's obviously a very useful bowler.
Joe, shut him up.
Or if it's Sean Pollock, who's the bowler.
He's a rounder.
Okay, fine.
And Joe Root's taken 5 for 8 in a Test match. He's arguably an all-rounder as well.
Yes.
I think it's got to be. The question is your rubbish batters versus your rubbish bowlers, right?
Yeah,
exactly. And then a bowler wins. Surely.
I don't think there's any dispute, really, is there? I mean, it would be
because bowlers probably average like 30 or 40.
Such brilliantly terrible. I'd love to watch Rory Burns bowling for a whole session at James Anderson.
Yeah, and also play it out at club level, right? Forget professional stuff. Play it out sort of Premier League club level. If Jack Leach batted for whoever in Somerset, then he'd get a fair few runs. But if Rory Burns opened the bowling or in Surrey club cricket,
you'd take him to pieces, wouldn't you, Phil?
All right, that might have been the subtext of my point, Joe.
That's where we were headed.
I just thought just let that one just drift out there. Fine.
Yeah, and obviously
Burns is going downtown. I tell you
that there is a value to bowlers working on their batting, and actually I think it's probably underappreciated the fact that like the likes of Jack Leach or James Anderson will sometimes hit a ball that is bowled at 90 miles an hour, which is something that I would literally never be able to do. Whereas like if you're a batter, there isn't much a point in getting better at bowling because you will likely never have to do it.
Rory Burns bowled a really bad over, I think. In protest in a game against Leicestershire, he wasn't happy with the umpires changing the ball, so he said, I'll have a bowl then, and it was awful.
What was he bowling?
Filthy medium pace. Yeah.
But then Chris Cook, when he took his gloves off in that silly game against Surrey at the end of the season, his first ball was an absolute sort of swinging jaffer that you do sometimes get. And you remember Azhar Ali did that at the very end of the second test.
Was it to Butler?
Yeah. And he looked embarrassed because it was clearly like it was the first ball of the final hour after which they could shake hands. So it was like, fine, I'll have a bowl. And he very nearly sort of damaged Joss Butler's average, and I think would have felt quite bad about doing so.
Right,
maybe you're right then. Scrap it.
Well, cheers, Phil. Cheers, Joe. Cheers, Ben. Paul, hope that you feel satisfied with our answers to that question there. This has been the Wisden Cricket Weekly podcast in association with Charles Tyrwhitt. Remember, please use the code Wisden20 at checkout. Thanks for all the kind words and messages we received over the past few weeks. It really does mean a lot. If you've enjoyed the show, please do tell your friends. And if you really do like the show, why not leave us a 5-star review on the podcast app. Cheers.